Here is another unofficial mock exam that gives you some good questions, some good thoughts, and I'll give you my interpretation of the solutions. And we don't know how they'll be graded, but we'll give you some ideas on that as well. This one says the letter E appears at 11% of all words in English, but textbooks might be different. So this guy took a sample of 200 words from a history book, found that 30 out of the 200 contain the letter E. Name the procedure that would be done here. This procedure is going to be a one sample Z test for proportions. A one sample Z test for proportions. Because it's a proportion, 30 out of 200, and there's only one sample. The appropriate hypotheses to carry it out. Now notice it said here, we want to see if it's different. So the HO is going to be that it's 11%. HA is going to be that it's different than 11% or not equal to. And of course, we've got to define what P is. So P is 11% versus P is not 11%, where P is the true proportion of words in this textbook that contain the letter E. Part C says if 11% was exactly true, we'd expect 22 words with E and 178 without. What are these? Well, these are the number of successes and failures that we would get. And then the successes and failures ensures that I have a large count and that I've essentially taken a big enough sample to allow the central limit theorem to result in an approximately normal sampling distribution. Because my sample size is large enough, because I have enough successes and failures, my sampling distribution will be approximately normal. We got a p-value of 0.071 with an alpha level of 0.05. What would I do with that? Well, since my p is not low, I would fail to reject HO. So it says interpret the p-value in context. What that means is if in fact 11% of the words in the book contain the letter E, there's about a 7% chance that I could get a sample like this one, 15%, or more extreme. That's what a p-value is all about. Now it says if I made an error, what type of error could it be? I like to memorize what a type 1 error is. A type 1 error is rejecting HO when it's true. But I didn't reject HO. I failed to reject HO, remember? So I must have made a type 2 error. I have failed to reject HO when I should have. The consequence there is that I continued to believe that the books were 11% or that they were just like the rest of the English language, but in fact they're not. So let's see how this might be graded. And then I'll get to the rest of these parts. These solutions will basically say the same thing I did, but you may want to pause it to have a look at them. Letter A, we don't have an idea exactly here, but I would suspect that you need to say the z-test, the one sample, and the proportion to get full credit. Probably 2 out of 3 would give you a partial. I'm guessing if you said something wrong, you might just miss this question entirely. For letter B, it's going to be really important that you use the symbol P, that you have a not equal to sign here. You can choose to write it as 0.11 instead of 11%. That's fine, but you must define your term. You must do that and include that part of it. It's a two-sided test because the question said, was it different? Letter C, they felt like you should include the phrase sampling distribution if you wanted to get full credit on that question. This one might take you a second to think about and think through. Remember, you don't have to get every part of every question totally right to make a good grade on this test. Letter D, again, we've got a big p-value, so we fail to reject HO. He put that in context, and then he explained what that means because it said explain a p-value. This is a type 2 error because we concluded the book is not different, but in fact it really is. So now let's look at the second half of this question. So they did a simulation and took a random sample of 200 fake words, each of which had 11% chance of containing an E, and counted how many of those words contained a letter E, and got this graph. And this graph contains 100 dots. So they did a simulation of 100 dots, or 100 groups of 200. So describe this distribution. It looks like it's approximately symmetric. Remember, that kind of jives with what we said about having large counts earlier. And then you need to include the center, the unusual observations, and the spread. So you could call these two numbers out here unusual if you wanted to. I don't necessarily know that they are unusual, but they want to know that you've addressed that, that the center is approximately in here, and that the spread goes from here to here. So the center, I don't know, is somewhere between 20 and 22 maybe. The spread goes from down here, whatever this number is, maybe 11 or 12, up to perhaps 37. And you can remember that with either cussing or putting on your socks, however you remember that. Without performing calculations, do you expect the mean to be similar to the median, less than the median, or greater? We expect it to be fairly similar because we think this graph is sort of symmetric. Be careful, don't say you expect it to be exactly the same. This graph's not exactly symmetric. I don't expect them to be exactly the same, but probably close to one another. Is it appropriate to say the simulation is a simulated binomial distribution? Why or why not? So remember, with a binomial distribution, I need to check four things. Was each one a success or a failure? Yes, because each word either has an E in it or it doesn't. Are the words independent of one another? Perhaps I would have to assume that they are independent of one another. Do I have a fixed number of words? Yes. 200. And is the probability the same every time? Yes, if we assume it's 11% every time. So how do the results of this simulation compare to the p-value provided in part D? Now this is a little bit tricky, so follow me here. In this problem at the beginning, it said we found 30 out of the 200 words contain the letter E. So on this graph, 30 out of the 200, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 dots were 30 or more. But remember, it was a two-sided test. So I've also got to include the other side. Now, what's the other side? Well, 30 was 8 away from the mean. 11% is 22. Right? So 22 to 30, that's 8. So now go 8 the other direction. So 22 minus 8 is 14. How many numbers do I have below that? Just one. If I were to draw on that, you could see it perhaps. I'm looking for a two-sided test. What's here or more plus what's here or less. That's 8 out of the 200. For a p-value of 8% according to the simulation. That actually matches up pretty well with the 7.1% that we got over there. And then letter J says, based on the results, how many words would you see in order to convince you that fewer words with the letter E, that the book has fewer words with the letter E than 11%. So fewer words, now it's the one-sided. If I stick with an alpha level of 5%, I'll change my pen color, 5%, if I look at this graph here, 1, 2, 3, 4, well, if I had 15 or fewer, that would give me a p-value of 4%. That would do it right there. Because I only had 4 numbers, or 4 simulations that had 15 words with E's in them or less, and that would get that trick done. Letter K, explain how you could use this simulation to estimate the IQR. Include your estimate in this answer. Okay, well, IQR, that's the 25th and 75th percentile, so I need to count 25 dots from the bottom, 25 dots from the top, because I know there's 100 dots on here. So I'll pause this and count. So when I counted in, I got these two values right here, which is 19 and 25, which would give me an IQR of 6. You know, I might have miscounted by 1, and you might miscount by 1. I think if it's clear, and you can see I labeled them over here, if it's clear what you're doing, and you get the idea that this is the 25th, this is the 75th, then I think you're going to end up with good credit on that. In fact, I would probably explain that through as I worked the problem. So now let's talk about how those answers might look if you wrote them down and some ideas on getting full credit. This one said, note describing it as approximately normal is okay because we said that earlier. Symmetric is is a little bit safer word, but either way, roughly or approximately is a pretty important idea. And it says center shape, spread, and context required for an E. I think you should also address outliers or potential outliers to be safe. Note on part G, they said if the response too strongly said the mean and the median are exactly the same, you can't get an E. So you need to be cautious about that. We don't think they're the same. We think they're close to the same. And again, if you want to read this, just pause the video and you can read it. Big idea on this next part is this. Anything lacking context is deducted a level. Context is huge. Context is huge. Context is huge. On I, they noted that if you only did the one-sided test, you got a 7%. A two-sided test gave you an 8%. Just be careful with that. That's kind of a tricky thing, and yes, they would be looking for that on this kind of problem. On J, I stayed with a 5% level of significance. If you changed it, that's fine, but it should be clear that you've got a standard that you're using here. And then letter K, they said how they did it. I think that's a great plan, how they came up with this. They figured out Q1 and Q3, and you could say they subtracted them to get that. The numbers I had were a little bit different. I think that's going to be okay, especially if you've clearly stated how you did it. So there's question 1.